March 1919. A railway siding in the Austrian countryside before dawn. A British officer stands on the platform in the cold, supervising the boarding of a private train. The arrangements have been made quietly, and there is an armed escort, because nobody is entirely certain what will happen if a crowd forms. A man walks toward the carriage carrying one of his children. He is 31 years old. His wife follows with the others. There are a great many children. The youngest is an infant. 3 months ago, this man ruled 50 million people. His name is Karl. Until November, he was Emperor of Austria, Apostolic King of Hungary, King of Bohemia, and the holder of a list of titles so long that formal documents abbreviated it. His family had held power in Central Europe since the Middle Ages. 600 years of continuous rule, through the Reformation, the Ottoman Wars, Napoleon, and the transformation of Europe from a continent of kingdoms into a continent of nations. Now he is boarding a train under British protection because his own government cannot guarantee his safety, and because the new republic wants him gone. Within months, he will have no property, no citizenship, and no legal right to set foot in the country his family built. Most accounts of the Habsburgs stop somewhere around here. The empire falls, the dynasty exits, the story ends. But it does not end. What follows is a 100-year saga that includes a failed attempt to retake a kingdom by force, death in poverty on an island in the Atlantic, a personal confrontation with Adolf Hitler, a flight across occupied France, decades of statelessness, and finally something that almost nobody expects. Because 70 years after this train pulled out of that siding, a Habsburg would help pry open the border that ended the division of Europe. This is the story of what actually happened to Europe's most powerful family after they lost everything. To understand the scale of the fall, you have to understand what the Habsburgs actually were, because the word empire undersells it. They did not begin as emperors. They began as a minor noble family in what is now Switzerland and southern Germany, holding modest territory and a castle. Their rise started in the 13th century when Rudolf of Habsburg was elected King of the Romans, Chunt. Chosen in part because the other princes considered him weak enough to be manageable. That was a serious miscalculation. Over the following centuries, the family accumulated crowns with a persistence that has no real parallel in European history. And crucially, they did it less through conquest than through inheritance and marriage. There is a Latin saying that attached itself to them: "Let others wage war, you, fortunate Austria, marry." It was not entirely fair. The Habsburgs fought plenty of wars. But the strategy was real. Marry the heiress. Secure the succession. Wait for the other line to die out. Inherit the territory. Repeat across generations. By the 16th century, under Charles V, the family held Austria, the Low Countries, much of Italy, Spain, and the Spanish possessions in the Americas, along with the title of Holy Roman Emperor. It was said his territories were so extensive the sun never set on them, a phrase later borrowed for the British Empire, but coined for the Habsburgs first. The family eventually split into Spanish and Austrian branches. The Spanish line died out in 1700. The Austrian line continued, and it ruled from Vienna over one of the most complicated political structures ever assembled. By the early 20th century, Austria-Hungary covered territory that today lies across a dozen modern countries: Austria, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, and portions of Poland, Ukraine, Romania, Serbia, and Italy. Roughly 50 million people. A dozen major languages: Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox Christians, Jews, and Muslims. It was, in a real sense, a supranational state, held together not by a shared nationality, because there was none but by dynastic loyalty, bureaucracy, and the person of the emperor. That last part matters, and it becomes important later. The glue was the family. The emperor for most of this period was Franz Joseph, who reigned for 68 years. He came to the throne in 1848 and died in 1916, in the middle of the First World War. To his subjects, he was less a monarch than a fixture of existence. Almost nobody alive could remember a time before him. His personal life was a catalogue of tragedy. His brother Maximilian was executed in Mexico. His only son Rudolf died in a murder-suicide at Mayerling. His wife Elizabeth was assassinated in Geneva, and his nephew Franz Ferdinand, the heir, was shot in Sarajevo in 1914. The killing that triggered the war that destroyed everything. Which brings us to Karl. Karl was Franz Ferdinand's nephew. He had never expected to rule. He was a young archduke with a military career and a happy marriage to Zita of Bourbon-Parma, and the throne was several deaths away. Then the deaths happened. And in November 1916, at 29, Karl became emperor of a state that was 2 years into a war it was losing. He inherited a catastrophe. The army had suffered enormous casualties. Food shortages were severe in the cities. The subject nationalities were increasingly convinced their futures lay outside the empire. And Austria-Hungary was militarily dependent on Germany, which meant its policy was increasingly set in Berlin. Karl's assessment was that the war would destroy the monarchy, and that peace was the only way to save it. Historians generally credit him with genuine sincerity on this point. So in 1917, he attempted something extraordinarily risky. Using his wife's brother, Prince Sixtus of Bourbon-Parma, who was serving in the Belgian army, he opened a secret channel to the French government to explore a separate peace. He went further than caution allowed. In a letter, he indicated support for French claims to Alsace-Lorraine, German territory, in a negotiation conducted behind Germany's back. The talks failed. And in 1918, when relations with France had deteriorated, the French premier made the correspondence public. The result was ruinous. To Germany, Karl was a traitor to the alliance, and Austria-Hungary's subordination to Berlin became total. To the Allies, he was a man who had negotiated in secret and then denied it. Unreliable. At home, his authority was badly damaged. He had attempted the one move that might have saved the dynasty, and its failure removed his remaining room to maneuver. The end, when it came, was faster than anyone anticipated. Through the autumn of 1918, the empire did not so much lose the war as dissolve. Czech leaders declared independence. The South Slav territories moved to join what would become Yugoslavia. Hungary separated. Polish territories moved toward the reconstituted Polish state. The army disintegrated as soldiers simply went home to their new countries. There was no single surrender, no decisive final battle on Austrian soil, no dramatic capture of Vienna. The state came apart from the inside, region by region, over a matter of weeks. On the 11th of November 1918, the same day the guns stopped on the Western Front, Karl signed a declaration. And the wording of that document became one of the most consequential legal questions of the following century. He renounced participation in the affairs of state. He acknowledged the right of the people to determine the form of government. He released his officials from their oaths. What he did not do was abdicate. He never renounced the throne itself, or his family's rights to it. In his own understanding, he remained the lawful monarch, temporarily withdrawn from the exercise of power. To the new Austrian Republic, this was intolerable. A monarch who had not abdicated was a monarch who could return, and around whom monarchist opposition could organize. So in April 1919, the Austrian parliament passed what became known as the Habsburg Law. It was comprehensive. The monarchy was formally abolished, and all Habsburg titles and privileges were void. The family's substantial property, palaces, estates, art collections, holdings accumulated over 6 centuries, was confiscated by the state. And members of the house were banished from Austrian territory. The law contained one exit. A Habsburg could return to Austria as a private citizen, but only by formally renouncing membership of the house and all claims to the throne, and declaring loyalty to the Republic. Karl refused. For him, the claim was not a preference. It was an inheritance held in trust for his son, and renouncing it was a betrayal of 600 years. So the family went into exile in Switzerland, living on loans and the goodwill of relatives, their assets gone. Then Karl began planning, because there was one part of the old empire where the situation was, on paper, still open. Hungary had not abolished the monarchy. It had declared itself a kingdom again, a kingdom without a king, governed by a regent, holding the throne in trust. The regent was Admiral Miklos Horthy, who had served in the Imperial Navy and had sworn an oath of loyalty to Karl personally. From a villa in Switzerland, with no money, no army, and no legal standing, the last emperor looked at that arrangement and reached a conclusion. His throne was still there, and he intended to go and take it back. In March 1921, Karl left Switzerland in secret, traveling on a false passport, and crossed into Hungary. The plan rested on a single assumption. Horthy governed as regent, in the king's name, under an oath sworn to Karl personally. If the king appeared in person and asked for what was legally his, the regent would hand it over. Karl reached Horthy in Budapest on Easter Sunday and made the request directly. Horthy refused. His reasoning was not sentimental, and it was not unreasonable. Hungary's neighbors, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Romania, had made their position explicit. A Habsburg restoration in Budapest would be treated as a threat to the entire post-war settlement, and they were prepared to intervene militarily to prevent it. The great powers held the same view. Horthy told Karl that a restoration would bring foreign armies into a country that had already lost 2/3 of its territory in the peace settlement. Whether he was protecting Hungary or protecting his own position is a question historians still argue over. Probably both. Karl withdrew and returned to Switzerland, humiliated, and then in October he tried again. The second attempt was more serious. Karl and Zita flew into Hungary by light aircraft, genuinely dangerous in 1921, and this time military units loyal to the king rallied to him. A force assembled and began moving on Budapest, and for a short period it looked as though it might succeed. Government troops were sent to stop it. There was fighting. Men died on both sides. Hungarians shooting at Hungarians over whether the king should have his throne. The advance was halted. Karl was arrested. This time the consequences were permanent. The Allied powers had watched a former emperor come close to seizing a European state by force, and they were not prepared to leave the possibility open. Hungary was compelled to formally depose the House of Habsburg, and the powers determined that Karl would be removed somewhere he could not cause any further difficulty. They chose Madeira. Madeira is a Portuguese island in the Atlantic, several hundred miles off the coast of North Africa. In 1921, it was remote in a way that is difficult to convey now, reachable only by ship, days from the European mainland. Karl and Zita were transported there by British warship. Their children followed later. At first they were housed adequately, but the family had no money. The Habsburg fortune had been confiscated in Austria, their Hungarian holdings were gone, and the exiled royal households of Europe were themselves mostly broke. When the funds supporting their accommodation ran out, they moved to a villa in the hills above Funchal called Quinta do Monte. The house was cold and damp. It sat high enough that cloud regularly settled around it, and moisture came through the walls. There was no adequate heating. In March 1922, Karl walked into town with one of his sons and caught a chill on the way back. It developed into bronchitis, then pneumonia. There was little that could be done. He died on the 1st of April 1922, at the age of 34, in a rented villa on an Atlantic island, 3.5 years after ruling 50 million people. Zita was 29 years old. She had 7 children with her and was pregnant with the 8th. She put on black mourning dress. She wore it every day for the next 67 years, until her own death in 1989. And she made a decision that shaped everything that followed. She gathered her children and told the eldest, a 9-year-old boy named Otto, that he was now the head of the House of Habsburg. Not in a ceremonial sense. In her understanding, Karl had never abdicated, which meant the claim had passed intact to his son. Otto was, from that moment in his mother's view, the lawful emperor of Austria and king of Hungary. He was 9, stateless, and effectively penniless. What Zita did over the following 2 decades is genuinely remarkable, whatever one thinks of the cause. The family moved to Spain, hosted by King Alfonso XIII, then later to Belgium. They lived on the charity of relatives and monarchist supporters, in circumstances that were respectable but constrained. There were no palaces. And through it all, Zita ran her son's education like a campaign. Otto was taught languages until he was fluent in most of the major tongues of the former empire: German, Hungarian, Croatian, English, French, Spanish, and more. He studied law, political science, history, and economics, eventually taking a doctorate at Louvain in Belgium. He was drilled in the constitutional histories of every territory his family had governed. He was being trained, with total seriousness, for a job that legally no longer existed. Zita never wavered. In her mind, the republics were temporary and the dynasty was permanent, and her role was to deliver her son ready for the moment history corrected itself. That moment never arrived. But the training produced something unintended, one of the most formidably educated political minds in 20th century Europe. And in the 1930s, that mind was pointed at the man rising in Germany. Otto von Habsburg understood early and clearly what Adolf Hitler represented, and he was uncompromising about it. His opposition was rooted in something specific. The Habsburg Empire had been a multi-ethnic state in which a dozen nationalities lived under one crown, and its entire governing logic, however imperfectly applied, was that peoples of different languages and religions could coexist within one political structure. Nazi ideology was the precise inverse: a single racial nation, purified, dominating everything around it. It was the negation of the world Otto had been raised to inherit. He also understood the practical threat. Hitler was Austrian by birth, and had made clear that Austria's absorption into Germany was a founding objective. So Otto acted. He wrote publicly against the Nazi regime. He maintained contact with Austrian political figures. And in early 1938, as German pressure on Austria intensified, he wrote directly to Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg, offering to return to Austria and take on the chancellorship himself if it would help mount resistance to the annexation. It was, by any measure, a serious offer. Otto was proposing to walk into Vienna, a city he was legally banned from entering, and place himself in front of the German advance. Schuschnigg declined. He was in an impossible position, and calculated correctly that a Habsburg in the chancellery would have handed Hitler a pretext and alarmed the very powers whose support Austria needed. In March 1938, German troops crossed the border. Austria was annexed with almost no resistance. Hitler's response to Otto was not subtle. The remaining Habsburg property in Austria was seized. Otto was condemned by the regime, and orders were issued for his arrest, with the clear expectation that he would not survive custody. Members of the family who remained within reach were arrested, and several were sent to concentration camps. And in a detail that says a great deal, the German military plan for the annexation of Austria was code-named Operation Otto. Hitler named the invasion after him. The family fled. Zita and her children moved ahead of the German advance. First within Belgium, then, when Germany invaded in 1940, in a chaotic escape across France as the front collapsed behind them. They crossed into Spain, then Portugal, and eventually secured passage to the United States. They arrived as refugees. The head of the House of Habsburg, heir to 6 centuries of European power, entered America as a stateless person fleeing a regime that wanted him dead. Otto spent the war in Washington. He met Roosevelt, lobbied Allied governments, and worked on a single consistent objective: that Austria should be treated as Hitler's first victim rather than a willing partner, and that it should be restored as an independent state after the war rather than absorbed permanently into Germany. He also argued, with less success, for the post-war future of Central Europe as a whole, warning against leaving the region exposed to Soviet domination once Germany was defeated. Some of this worked. The Allied declaration on Austria in 1943 did describe the country as the first victim of Nazi aggression and committed the Allies to re-establishing a free Austria, an outcome Otto had actively worked toward. Some of it did not. Central Europe's post-war fate was settled by the position of armies, not by the arguments of an exiled archduke. The war ended. Austria was liberated, occupied by the 4 powers, and eventually restored to full independence in 1955. And Otto von Habsburg, who had opposed Hitler from the beginning, who had offered to return and resist the annexation, who had spent the war arguing for Austrian independence in Washington, still could not go home. The Habsburg Law of 1919 remained in force. His name was on it. The Austrian government's position was unchanged. He could enter as a private citizen, on one condition. He must sign a declaration renouncing membership of the House of Habsburg and all claims arising from it, and declare his loyalty to the Republic. He would have to sign away the thing his mother had spent his entire childhood teaching him he was. Otto was in his 40s by now. He had never seen Vienna as an adult. He had been outside Austria since he was 6 years old. The document was waiting. And his mother was still alive, still in black, still absolutely certain that the claim was sacred and that no one had the right to surrender it. Otto von Habsburg spent years turning the question over, and the way he eventually resolved it tells you almost everything about him. He concluded that the claim was worthless. Not illegitimate. He never accepted that the 1919 law had been just. Worthless in the practical sense. Austria was a functioning republic, and its people had no appetite for a restoration. Holding a legal claim to a throne nobody intended to offer him bought nothing. It kept him permanently outside the country he wanted to serve, and it kept him irrelevant. So in 1961 he signed. He declared that he was not a member of the House of Habsburg, renounced all claims to the throne, and affirmed his loyalty to the Austrian Republic as a citizen. His mother never accepted it. Zita, then approaching 70 and still in mourning black, regarded the renunciation as invalid. A document extracted under duress, incapable of dissolving something inherited by blood. Mother and son remained close, and they never resolved this. She died in 1989 still, in her own mind, the widow of a lawful emperor. Even after signing, the Austrian government resisted. The declaration triggered a constitutional crisis, with the 2 main political parties in open conflict over whether to admit him. Legal proceedings ran for years. It took until 1966, 5 years after signing, and 47 years after that train left the siding, for Otto von Habsburg to set foot in Austria. He was 53 years old. He had last seen the country as a small child. And then he did the thing that makes this story worth telling. He did not spend the rest of his life as a ceremonial relic. He looked at the political landscape of post-war Europe and found something he could actually do with everything his mother had taught him. The idea was European integration. Consider why it fits so precisely. The Habsburg Empire had been a multinational state, a dozen peoples, a dozen languages, several religions, held together under a single political roof. Its central premise was that nationalities did not require separate states to coexist, and that a supranational structure could contain them all. That structure had been destroyed in 1918 and replaced by nation-states, and within 20 years, those nation-states had produced the most destructive war in human history. Otto's conclusion was that his family's political architecture had not been wrong, only its method. What had been assembled through dynastic inheritance and imposed from above could be rebuilt through voluntary agreement from below. He joined the Pan-European Union, one of the oldest organizations advocating European unification, and became its international president in 1973. Then, in 1979, the European Parliament held its first direct elections, and Otto von Habsburg stood as a candidate in Germany. He won, and he served as a member of the European Parliament for 20 years, until 1999. Pause on that. The man who would have been Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary spent 2 decades as an elected representative, sitting in committees, voting on legislation, doing the ordinary work of a parliamentarian in a democratic institution. He had gone from claiming a throne by inheritance to holding a seat by election. And his particular focus throughout those decades was the half of Europe nobody in Brussels was talking about. Otto never accepted that the division of Europe was permanent. While Western European politicians treated the Iron Curtain as a fixed feature of the landscape, he insisted continuously that Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the rest were European nations temporarily separated from the continent, and that any conception of Europe that excluded them was incomplete. This was, for most of his career, regarded as sentimental and unrealistic. He was a man from a vanished empire talking about lands his family used to rule. Then came 1989. By the summer of that year, the Eastern Bloc was under enormous strain. Hungary, in particular, had been liberalizing, and in May, its government had begun dismantling sections of the electrified fence along its border with Austria, a decision driven partly by cost and partly by reformist politics within the Hungarian leadership. But the border was not open. Crossing without authorization remained illegal, guards were still posted, and the standing assumption everywhere in the Eastern Bloc was that they would shoot. Meanwhile, thousands of East Germans had traveled to Hungary on holiday visas and were camping near the border, hoping for a way west. In August, Hungarian opposition activists and Otto von Habsburg's Pan-European Union organized an event near the town of Sopron on the Hungarian side of the Austrian border. It was billed as a friendship picnic, a symbolic gathering to celebrate a Europe without barriers, with participants from both sides meeting at a disused border crossing. Otto was the patron of the event. His daughter attended in his place. A senior Hungarian reformist politician was the co-patron, which mattered enormously because it signaled that elements within the Hungarian government were behind it. The plan was that the gate would be opened briefly for a ceremonial crossing. Leaflets advertising the picnic had circulated among the East Germans camped nearby. On the 19th of August, 1989, the gate was opened, and several hundred East Germans ran through it. They came out of the woods and moved for the border in a mass. The Hungarian guards on duty faced a decision they had seconds to make, with orders that said one thing and a political situation that suggested another. They did not shoot. Roughly 600 people crossed into Austria that day. It was the largest single escape from the Eastern Bloc since the Berlin Wall went up in 1961. The consequences moved fast. The news reached East Germany immediately, and the flow of people toward Hungary became a flood. In September, Hungary formally opened its border, and tens of thousands crossed. The pressure that produced the demonstrations in Leipzig and Berlin built directly on it. On the 9th of November, 1989, less than 3 months after the picnic, the Berlin Wall fell. Historians are careful about single causes, and rightly so. The Eastern Bloc was collapsing under accumulated internal pressures, and the picnic did not cause that collapse on its own. But it was the moment the theory was tested in public. It established that the border could be crossed and the guards would not fire. And once that was demonstrated in front of the world, the entire system of physical containment lost its credibility. And the organization whose patron opened that gate was led by the man who would have been Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary, the heir to the dynasty that had lost that same border region in 1918. 71 years after his family was driven out of Central Europe, Otto von Habsburg helped open the door that ended its division. 3 months later, in a different sense, the story closed again. Zita died in March 1989, at the age of 96, having outlived her husband by 67 years and worn black for every one of them. Austria permitted her burial in Vienna, in the imperial crypt where the Habsburgs had been interred for centuries. The response was extraordinary. Enormous crowds lined the streets of a city that had expelled her family 70 years earlier. Hundreds of thousands watched the procession. The funeral followed the old imperial ritual, including the ceremony at the crypt door, in which the herald announces the deceased's titles and his refused entry, then announces them as a mortal sinner, and the door opens. A republic that had legislated the family out of existence turned out in enormous numbers to bury the last empress. Otto von Habsburg lived another 22 years. He died in July 2011 at the age of 98, having been born in 1912 in a functioning empire and having lived to see a united Europe with the Iron Curtain gone. His funeral in Vienna drew crowds comparable to his mother's, with representatives from across Europe. His heart, following Habsburg custom, was interred separately at an abbey in Hungary. The family today is led by his son, Karl von Habsburg, who has done something quietly characteristic. He served a term in the European Parliament, worked in media, and now focuses substantially on the protection of cultural heritage in conflict zones, serving as president of Blue Shield International, an organization dedicated to safeguarding monuments, archives, and cultural sites in war. There is a certain logic to it. A family that lost its own palaces, archives, and collections to confiscation in 1919 and to seizure in 1938 now works to prevent that happening to others. So what is the accounting a century on? They lost comprehensively in 1918. The throne is gone and is not coming back, and no serious member of the family pretends otherwise. The property was never fully recovered. The claim Zita defended so fiercely was signed away by her own son. And yet the family did not disappear, which is what happened to most deposed dynasties of that era. The Romanovs were killed. The Hohenzollerns faded into private life. The Ottomans dispersed. The Habsburgs rebuilt, not power, but relevance. And they did it by abandoning the one thing that had defined them for 6 centuries, the claim to rule by inheritance. Otto's insight was that the family's real asset was never the crown. It was the idea underneath it, that peoples of different languages and histories could live inside one political structure without destroying each other. That idea survived the empire, and he spent 50 years arguing for it in a form that required no throne, only a vote. Which is why a family that ruled by bloodline for 600 years ended up with its most consequential achievement being a border gate, open for 20 minutes, at a picnic. If this is the kind of history you come here for, the stories that keep running long after the textbooks close the chapter, then you are in the right place. This channel exists to follow the threads that everyone else drops. Subscribe and stay with us, because the next one we are opening up is a story about a family that lost an empire and quietly bought back something far more valuable.